Over these past few Sundays, as we have been gathering to celebrate our Eucharist, and as we've been reading through this section of St. Matthew's Gospel, we have been journeying with Jesus and the apostles to Jerusalem, where Jesus knows that he will face his suffering and his death. And so Jesus has been trying to convey to those that are following him, as well as the Jewish religious leaders, not only who he is, but what his ministry and mission is all about, and how it is that they are to live as his witnesses and his disciples. And so for these past weeks, we have been hearing a series of parables of Jesus that speak very much about what the kingdom of God is all about, and how his disciples are called to live and prepare for that kingdom. But as Jesus has been telling this particular set of parables, he has been directing them in a particular way to the Pharisees, to the scribes, to the chief priests, the leading religious officials, because of the fact that they have not gotten it, that despite all of their understanding of the law and the prophets, they have missed who Jesus is and what God's kingdom is all about. And as Jesus has been telling these parables, they have been enraging the scribes and the Pharisees. And now they have come to a point of boiling. They know that Jesus has been attacking them and their authority, and they are afraid that they are going to lose power and authority. They are afraid that they are going to lose the respect and the places of honor that they have. And therefore, they come to this point where they want to try to silence Jesus, where they want to try to distract people from following him, where they want to divide people. And this is where our gospel picks up this evening. We hear that the Pharisees were about to plot to try to entrap Jesus in order to bring about his demise. But not only are the Pharisees concerned about Jesus, but we also hear of another group, the Herodians. The Pharisees and the Herodians were diametrically opposed to each other on so many matters, but there was one thing that united them, and that was their hatred towards Jesus. And so the Pharisees and the Herodians begin to conspire of how they think they're going to get Jesus and finally silence him. They think they've come up with this clever plan of how they can entrap Jesus. And we hear that as they approach Jesus on that particular day, they begin with a great sense of flattery, trying to butter Jesus up. We hear that you are a wonderful teacher. We hear that you speak the way of God's truth. And then they ask him the question, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to the emperor or not? They thought they had Jesus in a corner. No matter what way he would answer the question, he would eventually turn the hearts and the minds of some people. If Jesus said that it was lawful to pay taxes to the emperor, then the Jewish people would be offended by what Jesus said, for they thought it was an abomination that they had to pay a tax to the pagan emperor of Rome. On the other hand, if Jesus said that it wasn't lawful to pay the taxes, he would raise the ire of the Roman authorities, who would punish him for being a rebel and starting an insurrection. And so the Pharisees and the Herodians thought they had Jesus trapped. No matter what way he answered, he'd be in trouble. But St. Matthew tells us that Jesus was too wise and cunning to fall into the trap, but instead he used it as an opportunity once again to be able to teach about who his Father is and what his Father's kingdom is all about. Jesus asks them for a coin, and therefore one of the Pharisees had to pull out this Roman coin from his pocket. And then Jesus asked the question, whose head and whose title is on it? And again they were forced to answer that it was the emperor's, it was Caesar's. And then Jesus looked at them and said, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's. And with that, Jesus answered the question perfectly. He recognized that as Jewish people, they had an allegiance to Caesar for the daily things of life, and therefore they were to give to Caesar what belonged to Caesar. But Jesus also recognized that they had an obligation to do the will of his Father, and so he said to them, "Give to God the things that belong to God." And in this perfect answer, Jesus balances those two realities, reminding the Pharisees, the Herodians, the crowds then, and us today, that in fact, as believers in him and his Father's kingdom, that we share a dual citizenship. Yes, it is true that they and we belong to this world and to the earthly powers of this world. And as such, we do have a moral obligation to follow the legitimate laws and authority of those that are in governance over us in the here and now. And that is why Jesus had no difficulty saying, "Give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar," that it was right to pay the tax because it helped support all of the infrastructure then and still today. But Jesus didn't leave it at that, because he knew that the earthly rulers did not have supreme authority, but only his Father in heaven. And so he continued on to give to God the things that belong to God, recognizing that their true allegiance is not just to the things of this world, but moreover, they are to his Father in heaven, and living out the call to be his disciples and to build his kingdom in the here and now. And with that answer, and with that understanding of the dual citizenship, Jesus was able then to help those that were following him recognize how it is that they were to live their lives. And he continues to enlighten us still today of how it is that we are to live our lives, that we recognize that we too are dual citizens. We belong to this world, we belong to this country, and therefore we are obliged to follow those laws that are morally acceptable to us. And we owe our allegiance then to those things that happen in the here and now. But we are not alone in our citizenship, but we also belong to God's kingdom, though imperfectly now, and hopefully perfectly one day at the end of the age. And therefore we must keep him at the center and the heart of our lives. Each time we hear this gospel passage from St. Matthew proclaimed, I'm reminded of the great saint, St. Thomas More, who lived in the 16th century. He was Lord Chancellor of England at the time that Henry VIII was ruling, and at the time when Henry VIII was taking his second wife, Anne. Henry VIII desperately wanted the blessing of the Catholic Church on this second marriage, but St. Thomas More recognized that he could not give his blessing. Despite all of the pressure that the king gave to him, More remained steadfast and faithful in his faith and in his belief. And even when threatened with imprisonment, More would not give in. And while imprisoned, when he was threatened with being put to death, More remained steadfast and faithful. For he recognized that he was to give to Caesar the things that were Caesar's, but to give the things of God to God. And as he was being led to his execution, More said those words that have come down to us in history. I am the king's good servant, but God's first. Thomas More recognized that he was a dual citizen. He was the king's good servant, but first and foremost, he was God's good servant. And therefore he was willing to do whatever was necessary to be able to uphold his baptismal dignity, to behold his belief in God and his membership in the kingdom of God. And he would be willing to shed his blood, to die a martyr's death, rather than to compromise his morals, his conscience, his faith. And as such, St. Thomas More then lived perfectly the wisdom of Jesus. Give to Caesar the things that are to Caesar, and give to God the things that are God's. And this is how we are called to live in our lives, recognizing our dual citizenship. And when there is a conflict between those two citizenships, we must choose God and God's kingdom first and foremost. And as we choose God's kingdom first and foremost in our lives, then everything else takes its rightful place. And so the challenge and the invitation that Jesus placed before the crowds long ago, and places once again tonight before us is whether or not we are God's good servants first, whether God is at the center and the heart of our lives, that as we go about not only our worship of Him, but then in the midst of our daily lives with our family, with our friends, in our places of work, in our places of recreation, do we also show that God comes first and that we belong first and foremost to His kingdom? Do our words and our deeds, our actions and our attitudes reveal that we are a part of God's kingdom? Are we acting as His ambassadors in the here and now, building up His kingdom so that one day we may enjoy it for all of eternity? And that is how we are called to be good stewards of the gift of our baptism and confirmation, by using well our time, our talent, our treasure, keeping God at the center and the heart of our lives. Then everything else finds its rightful place, and then we are filled with the spirit of joy, a spirit of contentment, a spirit of fulfillment. And so the challenge that we face tonight and every night is to be able to give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, to give to God the things that belong to God. Through the intercession of St. Thomas More, may we always choose to be God's good servants first and foremost in all that we are and all that we do. May our words and our actions, our attitudes and our deeds, when people are looking and when they are not looking, reflect our true citizenship as being children of God, members of His family, and heirs to His kingdom.